I'm Greg from Tri-State Generation and Transmission in Westminster, Colorado. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Support for this podcast comes from Sunrise Energy Ventures, a renewables provider weaving community and collaboration into the fabric of successful solar projects. Let Sunrise lower your costs by curating a custom-tailored solar plus storage solution that meets your energy needs.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. This month, the United States ushered in a new presidential administration and a new Congress, two developments with big implications for electric cooperatives. Here to talk us through some of what's to come are Stacey Alexander, a former congressional staffer and now a political and policy consultant with the firm's subject matter, and Louis Finkel, NRECA's Senior Vice President for Government Relations. Stacey, Louis, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I know this is probably a pretty busy time for you.
Well, we're happy to be here with you.
Concur. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
All right, so let's get right into it. This is a fairly significant transition that we're in the midst of. The White House and the Senate both going from Republican to Democrat. Stacey, I want to start with you. Let's get sort of a high-level look at what it means to manage a transition like this for a group like NRECA. Is this a particularly difficult one? Is this particularly difficult for the energy industry? Give us a sense of what's at stake.
Well, at a very high level, Scott, I think with any transition from one administration to the next, the most important goal really is a smooth transition from one president to the next and the continuation of government as we know it. The first order of business is having the administration sort of get sticky in the agencies, understand where things really are at that moment in time in terms of regulations that are outstanding or rules that are outstanding. Having gotten through that whole assessment, the next course of action is obviously to get your government built, which means agency secretaries and senior leaders who need to be confirmed must go through that process. And even as we sit here today, that process is underway, beginning with some of the financial leaders and ongoing. So once the agency leads are in place and the senior staff can really get going on developing policy proposals, then you start to see the first 100 days really come to life. And Louis, I don't know if you want to jump in there, but for this particular president and his administration, we know that Team Biden has as charge number one to address the COVID pandemic.
One of the really interesting changes that we've now seen as a result of change in control of the Senate is one of the big checks that a Republican Senate would have had on a Biden administration agenda would have been that confirmation process. And I think one of the notable changes that we'll now see as a result of the change in control of the Senate is that those cabinet confirmations, those agency confirmations, will likely move through a little bit quicker, a little bit cleaner, and you don't have that control with the Republican Senate being able to kind of hem and haw a little bit to push back on if you move too quickly, Joe Biden, on regulations, then we won't confirm your leading officials. So I think just as we think about what that agenda is going to look like and going through this transition period with both the Senate and with the administration, I think there's a big interplay there related to things we care about. We heard a lot from Biden during the campaign about his regulatory agenda and his regulatory ambitions. But I think, as Stacey noted, a lot of those ambitions will, at least in the short term, be on the back burner, not because they're not interested, but because the first two matters of business that we should all expect them to deal with is the health crisis created by the pandemic and the economic crisis created by the pandemic. And I think job one, surely, is to get arms around the pandemic with, increasing numbers of cases and hospitalizations and the need for distribution of a vaccine and getting the vaccine both manufactured and get the supply chain in place. And frankly, for electric cooperatives, to get that into our critical infrastructure employees. If our employees aren't healthy, they can't keep the lights on. And so I think that from our standpoint, getting that vaccine out into the public space is really important. And then the next step clearly is going to be to address the economic crisis, which will come in a lot of different forms. I think that we're looking at an economic agenda that's going to encompass some tax items, some investments in infrastructure, some investments in energy technology and deployment of energy technology, just to kind of quickly name a few. And I know we'll probably get more into that as we go, Scott.
Yeah.
But just as a high level, that's the way we're thinking about it and how we're engaging, how we engaged with the transition team and now how we're engaging with the new Biden.
Louis, talk a little bit about how we do that as co-ops. And Stacey, I'd like to hear how you kind of help manage that and how you advise your clients how to make sure you get in front of the right people.
Well, Scott, you've picked two good people to talk about this because I have, working with Jim Matheson, have kind of helped lead both our internal organization and our engagement with the transition, and have done that actually in partnership with Stacey. And what we've done is we've looked at the program holistically and our engagement holistically. Who are the right people to talk to within the transition? At a high level, kind of at the quote unquote front office of the transition. Who are the right people for us to be talking to within the agency review groups, whether it's USDA or EPA or the Department of Energy or the Department of Transportation? So we have been looking at what is most important to cooperatives, what is working in the agencies, what rules were put in place during the Trump administration that we think are important to maintain, what can be done better so we can be better served by government and better engage with our government about challenges and opportunities as electric cooperatives and things that we think are most important. And then I'll defer to my friend Stacey, who can kind of talk to you more about kind of how the approach that we've taken on where to bring those thoughts, what the most important places to bring those thoughts are.
Thanks, Louis. And this is such an important question you've asked, Scott, because truly understanding how to engage at all levels of government is something that takes a lot of practice. And a couple of the lessons learned over time and having seen a number of transitions play out over the years. And it really does not matter if it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. The most important thing you can do as an entity is to identify areas of agreement, develop policy ideas that are worth sharing, that are solutions oriented and early stages actionable. And NRECA has done an excellent job identifying, as Louis has said, areas of policy making that have worked and should probably rightly stay in place, and areas of policy that need to be developed that can be quickly actionable on shared goals. Despite some of the partisanship you see play out on TV, really, truly underneath that, there are Republicans and Democrats who have made a career of moving and advancing policies that really sort of solidify America's place in the world in terms of innovation, in terms of certainly energy and domestic energy independence. And I think all of those things remain today. So again, NRECA has done an excellent job going through the assessment of policies that should remain and developing a list of policies that should be advanced. And with good leadership, which you have, you as an organization are prepared to be effective regardless of who's in the White House. And so it really is seamless if you've done the preparatory work like NRECA has done.
Talk about some of the things that you see in the near term, both of you, that we can actually get done. Where are some areas where we can find some common ground and actually get things done?
Well, Scott, it doesn't matter who's in control of the House, the Senate, the administration. We're kind of made for this because we work with members on both sides of the aisle all the time to talk about electric cooperatives and what we care about. And we are prepared to engage with any policymakers, regardless of party affiliation or, frankly, geography in many cases, to share our message and our story. And we have a long history of doing this. And this isn't just about us at NRECA in Washington at a national level. This is our electric cooperatives around the country. They continue to engage with their elected officials at a local level, home in their states and their congressional districts, to carry our message. And so as we think about the priorities that are coming, as we think about this first 100 days and beyond, we're going to continue to carry the message about affordable, reliable energy delivery, about the importance of broadband connectivity, the importance of investments in communities and investments in our electric grid to ensure that all communities served by electric cooperatives, whether it's rural communities, suburban communities, it doesn't matter. We look at ourselves as nonpartisan in so many ways and try to transcend the party politics. And frankly, in a lot of ways, Scott, the narrowly divided Congress and the transition of power in the executive branch from one party to the other, we're made for this because we look for bipartisan solutions. We don't try to align ourselves with one party or another. And there are some great examples of that. I mean, I don't want to go too far back, but our enactment of the Rural Act at the end of 2019, it was a piece of bipartisan legislation with 300 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House and over 50 bipartisan co-sponsors in the Senate. That doesn't happen by accident. And it's because our local cooperatives around the country are engaging and partnering with their elected officials, carrying their voice to elected officials on what's most important to us.
That's a great point, Louis. Let's pick up on that discussion in a minute, but first I want to pause for a message from our sponsor.
Support for Along Those Lines comes from Sunrise Energy Ventures presenting this message. Modernize your grid with solar plus storage, the most affordable and widely adopted new generation, with over 81 gigawatts deployed in the U.S. Sunrise recognizes every utility is unique. That's why Sunrise Energy Ventures is committed to lowering your costs while greening your grid with a solar plus storage solution custom-tailored for your needs. Visit sunriseenergyventures.com today to learn how to predictably lower costs and take advantage of the most widely adopted form of new generation.
I'm Cammie Knoll from Adams Electric Cooperative in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Stacey, talk a little bit about what Louis was explaining with the way our co-ops advocate at the local level. And then let's get into a little bit of the specifics on some of the things that you see in the first 100 days, the first half a year of this administration, that are actually doable as far as getting things through Congress.
I think one of the things that most people miss about how our government operates at its best is that it's not just fancy lobbyists in Washington who get things done. It is absolutely more community voices that get things done. And particularly in an environment where we can rely on social media platforms to communicate with lawmakers and their staff now in ways that have changed, frankly, over the last decade. And so with so many new members of Congress and members of the Senate, they're engaging with their constituency in a minute-by-minute, free-flowing conversation on various platforms. And so that connectivity with local community interests is so valuable, and your voices are heard and relied on, and you truly are the experts that help new lawmakers become better at their job, and you are the experts that so many staff will rely on to answer very weedy questions, which takes me to your second question about what could happen in the first 100 days of this new administration. And truly, it's an exciting time, which may seem like a misplaced word, but it really is an exciting time because the balance of power is so delicate and the goals that must be met are so great. And so those two things combine to create an atmosphere that really can change where we go for the next decade. And having to collectively as a country fix the situation that we're in because of the pandemic. So that's one set of issues that will come straight out of the gate. But the really, truly exciting work is going to come in the form of what we're calling recovery, which is really a small word to describe such a big thing that must happen. I think it's multidimensional. I think it's not one policy action that will be recovery. I think it will be many. I think they'll follow swiftly one after another. I think they will be focused on, getting schools reopened, getting infrastructure built, getting, as Louis said, broadband deployed, all of these things together, and certainly not just those three things, are important and essential to getting our economy going. And I will say, there's been a lot reported recently about the financial institutions having a renewed focus on impacting energy policy, which for some may be a scary thought. But let's go back to this concept of injecting capital into the community and into communities and into the system to drive innovation, to drive not only innovating new technologies or interesting technologies, but actually leveraging them and bringing them to scale, creating creating more jobs, creating more opportunity for folks in communities that have been hard hit by the pandemic and other natural disasters too from years past. And so I think what we will see play out, Scott, is an interesting collaboration, if you will, between high-level finance institutions driving together with energy experts a new sort of frontier of innovation when it comes to energy. And that does not mean fossil fuel goes away. It probably means that the mix is here to stay for a long time, but we also come up with additional resources to power communities in a more dynamic way.
Mm-hmm.
And Scott, why don't I get a little more granular?
Yeah.
Kind of get into some of the bones that kind of fits into the construct Stacey's talking about for us as electric cooperatives. As we think about economic recovery, as we think about rebuilding our economy, there are some specific things that we think about that are important. So Stacey talked a little bit about capital markets and its intersection with energy. So one of the places that electric cooperatives really rely on our government is, and it stems back to the origins of electric cooperatives, is the rural utility service programs that provide financing, low cost in many cases, financing to our electric cooperatives for building their systems, for bringing on new generation, for system enhancements. And currently, interest rates are at historic lows, partly by action by the government and by the Trump administration to bring down those interest rates during the pandemic. And the current treasury rate is at 1.2%. And we, as electric cooperatives, are probably one of the only spaces in the economy that can't just refinance and reprice that debt. We've been watching during the pandemic that for-profit companies all over the country have been refinancing their debt to these low interest rates to try to bring in a little bit of extra capital and create a little additional flexibility. We don't have the ability to do that without paying a steep prepayment penalty to the government. And so one of the policy initiatives that we've been pressing for in the previous Congress and will push for with the next Congress and the Biden administration is to allow us to reprice that RUS debt without having to pay that prepayment penalty. We think it's only reasonable, both short term, because of the economic strain on our cooperatives from utility bill non-payment, because our most vulnerable, those that are out of work, can't pay their bills, but also long term as we think about recovering our economy, as we think about the prospect of energy transition and policies that will drive adoption of lower carbon emitting technologies, but also, frankly, the need for more electricity as our economy grows. The ability to reprice that debt now is really important. One of the campaign initiatives for Joe Biden, and frankly, this is one of those spaces that I think sits right in that bipartisan sweet spot, is infrastructure. And infrastructure is not just about roads and bridges, it's about electric delivery. It's about electric delivery both on the transmission system and the distribution system. And it's about broadband. It's about bringing broadband to local communities. It's about connecting our rural communities to the internet. And I think one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic is the critical importance of that, not just for goods and services and entertainment and surfing, but it's for people to do business. It's for children to be educated. It's for telehealth and distance medicine, especially in rural communities. If you live 300 miles from the closest hospital, then surely you want to be able to access a doctor before you got to drive that 300 miles. And so I think, Scott, as we're thinking about the challenges our country face, we look at this and we look at this transition with the new administration, and the prospect of really narrowly divided Congress means they're going to have to find bipartisan solutions to our challenges. And we think that that's a great opportunity for us. Now, I don't want to oversell this. We have learned that it is hard to legislate. And in really narrowly divided Congress, it is really hard to legislate. So surely there are challenges ahead through the legislative process. But from our standpoint, there are great opportunities for us to affect change in policy that can be wildly beneficial to our electric cooperatives and the communities they serve.
Yeah, and the point you make about infrastructure not just being about roads, it's about stuff that's very important to our sector and the economy overall. Is this something that's necessarily a legislative fix? Is infrastructure something that can get done without having to navigate that congressional situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Scott. So there are some places within that infrastructure debate that the administration has some flexibility. They can expedite permitting, okay? Within the current statutory framework, they could make it easier to do some of the things that we believe need to get done. But in order to build infrastructure, in order to build broadband systems, in order to, upgrade our electric grid, that requires money, and that requires a change in some cases, changes in law for siting. But without question, I think though there are some things you can do through existing statute, I think that a lot of the investments that need to be made, Congress is going to need to, commit money to it.
I'll just add to what Louis articulated. I think that we're heading into a 4-year period, and more likely beyond this current administration, where executive action in certain areas like pandemic response is going to be essential because it's faster, right? So we need to apply speed as part of the solution to sort of where we are economically. So I do think, Scott, it's a combination of the two. And certainly for the next 2 years anyway, the Congress is effectively President Biden's Congress, and he alone will be setting that agenda. And so oftentimes folks ask me, well, what about Secretary X or Y? He or she is this or that in terms of ideology. And I am careful to remind folks that secretaries serve at the pleasure of their president.
That's a great point, and that's a great transition, because I wanted to get into something that President Biden is passionate about and campaigned on, and that's climate policy. And this is something that disproportionately affects co-ops and the energy sector. Talk about some of the plans that he's articulated, talk about how we're going to try and shape that, and talk about some of the pitfalls that we're looking at with some of the ambitious goals that he's set.
I am happy to kick it off and have Louis give you finer detail as it relates to NRECA. But I want to say something first, which is there are clearly folks who have been well organized, who have a point of view on climate that is outside the boundaries of where the president is. Those people have an outsized voice, but not an outsized influence on policy. And I think that's an important level set. When it comes to the Biden administration, it's obvious and clear that meeting certain goals by 2050 are not only important, but essential in their minds. Essential on two fronts. One, acknowledging that the impacts of climate change are real, and also the derivative impact of addressing climate change on people and communities and the economy potentially, right? So I think what you will see for the first time is a unified approach across agencies. So Department of Education, Department of Transportation, Commerce, and the like, to meet or put in place metrics that will help drive outcomes to the 2050 goals. And I think while some are concerned that you'll see the big Green New Deal be talked about, certainly there are members of Congress who may raise it, but I don't think it's a practical outcome based on where we are. I think you'll see policy. So again, separating what's possible at agencies versus what's possible in terms of policy. I think you'll see policy developed that has to meet two thresholds. It has to sort of get at that 2050 goal, but also ensure that the economic impact is the right economic impact for the moment of time that we're in. And Louis, jump in with specifics on NRECA, but I think the balance of power being so narrow means that everybody will have a point of view that will be valid and can be shared. And I think at the end of the day, going back to common sense policy that is actionable, we may get an incremental framework put in place that helps us get to what we do believe are shared goals, not just domestically, but globally on climate.
So President Biden during the campaign put forward an ambitious plan for reducing our carbon emissions, with the goal ultimately of a zero carbon emissions economy by 2050 and a target of zero carbon emissions from the energy sector, from the electric sector by 2035. Those are really ambitious goals and frankly, pretty hard to achieve. So let's start from there. Stacey talked about two different pieces, the administration and their ability to get things done on this and Congress's ability. So let me start with Congress because I think it's important to start there and then I'll move back to the administration. 10 years ago, we went through this exercise where Congress tried to legislate on a system to dramatically reduce carbon emissions. And at that time, the Democratic majority in the House was much larger than it is today, and the Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate. And even then, it was really tough to get the bill through the House, and the bill failed to advance in the Senate. The result of that, you have to start from the premise that in a really narrowly divided Congress, that is even more difficult to get done. So then the next step was that the administration, then the Democratic administration, moved forward with a regulatory process. And that took a lot of time. Then the Trump administration came in and kind of unraveled and rebuilt that regulatory regime. And that took a lot of time. So with that as the backdrop, I think without question, we will likely see some executive orders from the president that apply directly to the federal government's engagement with energy. And what that means is federal government purchasing of energy, the federal government's surface transportation fleet, transitioning to electric vehicles. Those are things that are currently within the boundaries for the president to do through executive order without having to go through extensive, lengthy rulemaking. So I think that's the first piece. The second piece then is, and this is something that, advocates for carbon reduction are going to have to figure out, and when I say advocates for it within the government, Congress and the administration are going to have to figure out what their pathway is going to look like. And surely they've been thinking about that. And they've been thinking about whether or not this should be a legislative solution or a regulatory solution. Now, even if they go to a regulatory solution, that takes some time. Now, from our standpoint, it's pretty simple. Affordability and reliability. That is what we hold to be sacred. We need to ensure that we can keep the lights on in the communities we serve across the country without creating an economic burden for those communities. And so as we look towards the prospect of either legislation being proposed and attempts to advance it in Congress, or a regulatory process that tries to undo the current regulatory regime and work towards a new regulatory regime, those are the tenets that we continue to pursue. And those are the objectives that we will continue to advance. Electric cooperatives at their heart, we're agnostic about what the fuel source is, as long as that fuel source allows for affordable, reliable delivery to our communities. And, to be candid, Scott, some of the proposals that have been brought forward in Congress, like the Green New Deal, that doesn't work in our communities. And some of the regulatory proposals that have been mentioned by those groups that try to have a loud voice on some of these issues, those don't work for our communities. And frankly, as we're talking about a fragile economy that needs to be rebuilt and energized, I think it would be irresponsible to create some huge energy burden, especially on co-op communities, because there is a fundamental difference between investor-owned utilities that lean on their investors to carry the economic burden of an energy transition, and electric cooperatives, which are owned by those at the end of the line that are consuming the energy. And there's only one place for those costs to go, and it's to our member consumers in the communities that are owned by and served by electric cooperatives. So we take a different approach from some others in the energy sector on this, and frankly want to make sure that whatever is brought forward, that we carry our voice about affordability, reliability, and frankly, to those that advocate for this transition to a carbon-free energy sector, they should appreciate the need for a just transition that doesn't create more economic burden on some of our most vulnerable communities.
And Louis, I'll add to that, when you talk about reliable, affordable electricity, that value that NRECA holds is actually very well aligned with sort of the values that this new Congress holds when they talk about access and equity issues. Again, two words that have a lot of meaning. But I think it's important that, we consider translating your values and aligning them with theirs when you talk about making sure that those who need affordable, reliable electricity are getting it, because I think that is a very effective and also authentic counterpoint to some of the other policy arguments that are being made, which have the net result of not providing affordable, reliable electricity. at this time.
So let me add one small thing, Scott, and I want to plug something that we do collaboratively with our statewide around the country and with our local cooperatives. And Stacey talked about these newly elected members of Congress and engaging with them. So we develop what we call our quote unquote Co-op 101 program, where we have a presentation that we as NRECA have developed for use by our local cooperatives as they're introducing our cooperatives to their newly elected members of Congress. It's a really great tool, and we found it to be really effective to kind of create and craft that relationship with these newly elected members.
Those are great points. And honestly, I think it's sort of a luxury for us to have, as complex as this issue is, to have as an animating principle be affordable, reliable energy. And I think, that as long as that's informing everything we do, it does make things a little bit more simple. And there's just so much going on in the administration, writ large in the federal government, that you all are keeping track of. Stacey, Louis, thanks so much for taking the time again, and good luck with everything going forward.
Well, thank you, Scott. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Thank you for having me today. It was a pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
And thanks as well to you, our listeners, and to our sponsor, Sunrise Energy Ventures. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, I'm Scott Hoffman.
I'm Hannah Capozzi from Grand Canyon State Electric Cooperative Association in Tempe, Arizona. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.